I had spent my entire life learning to be invisible. Yet on that spring morning, the Duke of Ashworth looked at me as though I were the only soul in the cathedral. What happened next would shatter every truth I had ever believed about my place in this world. The scent of white roses hung heavy in the air of St. Margaret's Cathedral, mingling with the delicate perfume of 100 aristocratic ladies who had gathered to witness the union of the decade. I stood pressed against the cold stone of a pillar near the servants' entrance, my hands folded neatly before my plain gray dress, my eyes cast downward as I had been taught since the age of 15 when I first entered service at Ashworth Manor. I was there to attend to any need that might arise, to fetch water or carry messages, to exist without being seen, without being heard, without mattering to anyone who filled those gilded pews. The organ music swelled through the vaulted ceilings, and I allowed myself one brief glance toward the altar, where His Grace, Edward Blackwell, the 7th Duke of Ashworth, stood waiting for his bride. He was tall and severe, his dark hair swept back from a face that seemed carved from marble, beautiful in the way that winter is beautiful, all sharp edges and cold magnificence. I had served in his household for 3 years, and in all that time, I had never once seen him smile. The other servants whispered that he had been different once, before his mother's death, before the weight of the dukedom had settled upon his shoulders like a shroud. But I knew only the man who walked through halls as though he were already a ghost, who spoke in commands rather than requests, who looked through servants as though we were made of glass. Lady Arabella Sinclair was to be his Duchess. She was the daughter of the Earl of Pemberton, a woman of impeccable breeding and legendary beauty, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes like summer sky. Their engagement had been announced 6 months prior, a perfect alliance of wealth and title, and all of London had spoken of nothing else. I had seen her during her visits to the manor, had pressed her gowns and arranged her chambers, had watched the way she moved through rooms as though the very air should be grateful for her presence. She was everything I was not, everything I could never be, and I had accepted this truth the way one accepts the rising of the sun. The music shifted, signaling the entrance of the bride, and every head turned toward the great doors at the back of the cathedral. I watched from my shadowed corner as those doors opened, as the light streamed in, as Lady Arabella appeared in a gown of ivory silk and Brussels lace, a vision so perfect that several ladies pressed handkerchiefs to their eyes. Her father, the Earl, stood beside her, his chest puffed with pride, his hand guiding hers as they began the long walk down the aisle. I should have returned my gaze to the floor. I should have remained invisible, as I had always been, as I was meant to be. But something made me watch, some strange stirring in my chest that I could not name. And so I saw what no one else seemed to see in that moment. I saw the way Lady Arabella's steps faltered, just slightly, just enough to notice if one were truly looking. I saw the way her free hand trembled against the cascade of her bouquet. I saw the way her eyes darted toward the stained glass windows as though calculating the distance to freedom. She was afraid. Not the gentle nervousness of a bride, but something deeper, something desperate, something wild. They reached the altar. The Earl placed his daughter's hand in the Duke's, and the bishop began to speak, his voice resonating through the sacred space with words of union and duty and eternal bond. I watched the Duke's profile, stern and unreadable, and I watched Lady Arabella, who had grown pale as fresh snow, whose breathing had become shallow and quick. The bishop asked if any present knew of any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony. Silence fell, heavy and expectant, and then Lady Arabella spoke. "I cannot do this." Her voice was barely a whisper, but in that silence it carried like a thunderclap. The Duke turned to her, his brow furrowing in confusion, and she repeated herself, louder now, her voice breaking, "I cannot do this. Forgive me, I cannot." What happened next would be spoken of in drawing rooms and scandal sheets for years to come. Lady Arabella Sinclair, the most sought-after bride in all of England, tore her hand from the Duke's grasp, gathered her skirts, and ran. She ran down the aisle like a woman fleeing a fire, her veil catching on a candelabra and ripping free, her bouquet scattering white roses across the marble floor. The guests erupted in gasps and cries. The Earl shouted his daughter's name, and the great doors of the cathedral slammed open as she disappeared into the spring morning. For a long moment, no one moved. The Duke stood frozen at the altar, his face still turned toward the doors through which his bride had fled, and I watched something pass across his features, something I had never seen there before. It was not heartbreak. It was not even anger. It was the cold realization of ruin, the understanding that in the space of 30 seconds, his reputation, his standing, his very future had been shattered before 500 witnesses. The whispers began almost immediately, spreading through the pews like a plague. The Dowager Countess of Ashworth, the Duke's aunt, rose from her seat in the front row, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. The Earl of Pemberton was shouting for someone to find his daughter, his face purple with rage and shame. Ladies fanned themselves as though they might faint. Gentlemen exchanged glances that spoke of scandal and consequence. I should have slipped away. I should have returned to the servants' quarters, to my small room beneath the eaves, to the safety of my invisibility. But my feet would not move. I stood there, pressed against my pillar, watching as the Duke slowly turned to face the congregation, as he surveyed the chaos that surrounded him with eyes that had gone utterly cold. His gaze swept across the cathedral, across the gasping aristocrats and the weeping ladies and the muttering gentlemen. And then, impossibly, inexplicably, his gaze found me. I do not know what he saw in that moment. A servant girl with brown hair pinned beneath a simple cap, with eyes the color of autumn leaves, with hands roughened by years of work. Nothing remarkable, nothing worthy of notice. And yet he looked at me, truly looked at me, as though seeing me for the first time, as though I had suddenly become solid after years of being a ghost. He began to walk, not toward the doors through which his bride had fled, not toward his aunt who was calling his name, not toward the bishop who stood at the altar with his mouth agape. He walked toward me, each step deliberate, each step measured, and I felt my heart begin to pound against my ribs with a force that frightened me. The congregation fell silent, watching, wondering what the Duke of Ashworth could possibly want with a servant girl in the corner of the church. He stopped before me. He was taller than I had realized, tall enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes, and up close, I could see the lines of strain around his mouth, the shadows beneath his eyes, the weight of 30 years of duty and expectation that he carried in every line of his body. "Your name," he said. His voice was low, rough, as though the words cost him something to speak. I could barely breathe. "Eleanor," I whispered. "Eleanor Graves, Your Grace." Something flickered in his eyes, something I could not read, and then he reached out and took my hand. His grip was firm, but not unkind. His fingers warm against my cold skin, and I felt a shock run through me at the contact, at the impossibility of a duke holding the hand of a maid. "Miss Graves," he said, and his voice carried now, carried across the silent cathedral so that every ear could hear. "I find myself in need of a bride. The contract with the Sinclair family stipulated that a marriage must take place today, before this congregation, or the consequences shall be severe." He paused, and I saw something desperate beneath the ice of his expression, something almost human. "I would not ask this of you if I had any other choice, but I am asking. Will you marry me?" The words did not make sense. They could not make sense. I was a servant, a nobody, a girl who had been raised in an orphanage and had known nothing but work and duty and the invisibility of the lower classes. Dukes did not marry servant girls. It was not done. It could not be done. The very idea was madness. And yet he stood before me, the most powerful man I had ever known, holding my hand and waiting for my answer. "Your Grace," I breathed, my voice shaking. "I do not understand. I am no one. I am nothing. I cannot be your Duchess." His jaw tightened. "You are a woman of marriageable age," he said, his tone clipped and practical. "You are unmarried, are you not? You have no family to object, no prior engagement to nullify. You are, at this moment, the only acceptable option available to me. The contract must be fulfilled, or I lose everything: the estate, the title, the legacy of 7 generations. I stared at him, my mind reeling, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain he must hear it. Around us, the congregation had begun to murmur again, scandalized whispers spreading like wildfire through the pews. I could feel the weight of their gazes upon me, judging me, dismissing me, wondering what possible reason the Duke could have for speaking to a creature so far beneath him. I should have said no. Every instinct I possessed, every lesson I had ever learned about my place in this world, screamed at me to refuse, to step back, to return to my shadows where I belonged. I was not made for silk and jewels and the glittering halls of the aristocracy. I was made for early mornings and scrubbing floors and the quiet satisfaction of work well done. But there was something in his eyes, something beneath the cold, beneath the desperation, beneath the calculation, something that looked almost like pain. And I realized in that moment that Edward Blackwell, the Duke of Ashworth, was not simply a man seeking to save his fortune. He was a man who had been abandoned at the altar before 500 witnesses, a man whose pride had been shattered, whose heart, if he had one, had been publicly scorned. He needed me, not because I was special, not because I was worthy, but because I was there and I was willing, and sometimes that is enough. I took a breath. I felt the weight of my entire life hanging in the balance. The past I had fled and the future I could not imagine. And I made my choice. "Yes," I said, and my voice was steadier than I had expected. "Yes, Your Grace. I will marry you." Something shifted in his expression, something that might have been relief or might have been resignation, and he nodded once, sharply, as though closing a business transaction. He did not smile. He did not thank me. He simply turned, my hand still in his, and began to walk back toward the altar. The congregation erupted. Ladies cried out in shock. Gentlemen shouted objections. The Dowager Countess rose from her seat with a face like thunder. But the Duke did not stop, did not hesitate, did not acknowledge a single voice of protest. He walked with the certainty of a man who had made his decision and would not be swayed, and I walked beside him, my plain gray dress a stark contrast to the ivory and gold that surrounded us. The bishop was stammering, his face pale, his hands trembling as he clutched his prayer book. "Your Grace," he managed, "this is most irregular. The banns have not been read. The license bears Lady Arabella's name. I cannot simply—" The Duke reached into his coat and withdrew a document, pressing it into the bishop's hands. "A special license," he said, his voice cold and final. "Signed by the Archbishop himself. It permits marriage to any woman I choose, at any time, in any place. The name is irrelevant. What matters is that a marriage takes place." The bishop read the document, his eyes widening, and I saw him look to the Dowager Countess as though seeking guidance. But the Duke's aunt had gone very still, her sharp eyes fixed upon me with an intensity that made me want to shrink away, to disappear, to become invisible once more. "Proceed," the Duke commanded, "now." And so, in the space of an hour, I went from servant to Duchess. The ceremony was brief and cold, spoken in hurried tones by a bishop who could barely meet our eyes. There were no tender vows, no loving gazes, no gentle promises of forever. There was only the ring, a band of gold and diamonds that had been meant for another woman's finger, slipped onto my hand by a man whose face betrayed no emotion whatsoever. There was only the declaration, the pronouncement that we were man and wife, the seal of law and church upon a union that should never have been. When it was done, the Duke released my hand and turned to face the congregation. He said nothing. He did not need to. His silence spoke louder than any words could have, a challenge to anyone who dared question what had just occurred. And though the whispers continued, though the scandalized glances burned against my skin, no one rose to object. No one dared. We left the cathedral through a side door, away from the crowds and the chaos and the carriages that waited to carry guests to a reception that would never happen. The Duke's carriage stood alone in the alley, black and gleaming, and a footman rushed to open the door as we approached. I climbed inside on trembling legs, my mind still struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The Duke followed, settling onto the seat across from me, and for a long moment we simply sat in silence as the carriage lurched into motion, carrying us away from St. Margaret's and toward a future I could not begin to imagine. "I should thank you," he said at last, his voice flat and distant. "What you have done today has saved my family from ruin." I looked at him, this man who was now my husband, this stranger whose name I had taken, whose home I would share, whose life I would become a part of. I did not know what to say. I did not know what was expected of me. I knew only that everything had changed, that the life I had known was gone forever, and that I was more frightened than I had ever been. "You must have questions," he continued, when I did not respond, "about the arrangement, about what will be expected of you." I found my voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. "I have many questions, Your Grace." His expression did not change. "Ask them." I hesitated, gathering my courage, trying to form coherent thoughts from the chaos in my mind. "The contract you spoke of," I said. "What happens now that you are married? Is your estate truly saved?" For the first time, something like humanity flickered across his features. "The contract," he said, "was signed 3 years ago, before my father's death. An agreement with the Earl of Pemberton that would settle certain debts and secure certain lands in exchange for a marriage alliance. If the marriage did not take place by today, the contract would be voided, and the Earl would have been entitled to claim a significant portion of the Ashworth holdings." He paused, his jaw tightening. "That danger has now passed. The marriage has taken place. The contract is fulfilled." I nodded slowly, trying to understand the web of obligation and finance that had led to this moment. "And Lady Arabella?" I asked carefully. "Do you know why she fled?" His expression hardened, the brief glimpse of humanity disappearing behind the ice. "I neither know nor care," he said. "She has made her choice. Let her live with the consequences." I fell silent, sensing that I had touched upon a wound too raw to be examined. The carriage rolled on through the streets of London, and I watched the buildings pass by through the window, the grand houses of Mayfair giving way to the even grander estates that lined the road to the countryside. Somewhere ahead lay Ashworth Manor, the place I had called home for 3 years, though I had only ever known its servants' quarters and back hallways. Now I would walk through the front doors. Now I would sleep in the Duchess's chambers. Now I would sit at the head of the table and receive callers and attend balls and do all the things that a woman of my station had never been permitted to dream of. The thought was terrifying. "Your Grace," I said, forcing myself to speak, to ask the question that burned most urgently in my mind. "What am I to you now? What do you expect from this marriage?" He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some point beyond the carriage window. "I expect discretion," he said at last. "I expect you to learn the duties of a duchess and perform them adequately. I expect you to present a unified front to society, to quell the rumors and scandals that will surely arise." He turned to look at me, his eyes cold and assessing. "Beyond that, I expect nothing. This is an arrangement of convenience, nothing more. You shall have your own chambers, your own allowance, your own freedom within the bounds of propriety. In exchange, you shall give me an heir when the time is appropriate and conduct yourself with dignity in public. The words should have stung. They should have made me feel small, reduced to nothing more than a vessel for his legacy and a shield for his reputation. But instead, I felt something unexpected. I felt relief. He was not demanding love or devotion or the surrender of my heart. He was offering a transaction, clear and cold and honest, and there was a strange comfort in that clarity. "I understand," I said. "I will do my best to fulfill my duties, Your Grace." He nodded once, sharply, and turned back to the window. The conversation, it seemed, was over. We arrived at Ashworth Manor as the sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. I had seen the great house 1,000 times, had polished its silver and beaten its carpets and carried coal to its fireplaces. But I had never truly looked at it, never allowed myself to appreciate its grandeur, for such appreciation was not meant for people like me. Now I looked at the sweeping facade of honey-colored stone, at the rows of tall windows that caught the dying light, at the manicured gardens that stretched away in every direction, at the fountain that splashed in the center of the circular drive. It was beautiful. It was magnificent. It was utterly, terrifyingly mine. The carriage rolled to a stop before the main entrance, and a footman rushed to open the door. The Duke descended first, then turned and offered me his hand. I took it, feeling the strength of his grip, the steadiness that contrasted so sharply with my own trembling, and allowed him to help me down onto the gravel drive. The household staff had assembled on the front steps, as was customary for the arrival of a new mistress. I recognized every face, had worked beside every one of them, had shared meals and gossip and the quiet camaraderie of those who serve. Now they looked at me with expressions I could not read, a mixture of shock and confusion, and something that might have been resentment. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, stood at the front of the line, her face carefully blank. She had been my superior for 3 years, had corrected my work and assigned my duties and occasionally offered a kind word when the days grew long. Now she curtsied before me, her eyes downcast, her voice steady. "Welcome home, Your Grace." The title felt like a costume, ill-fitting and strange. I wanted to tell her that nothing had changed, that I was still Eleanor, still the girl who had scrubbed the kitchen floors and mended the linens and dreamed of nothing more than a quiet life. But the Duke's hand was firm on my arm, guiding me forward, and I knew that such words would only make things worse. "Mrs. Pemberton," the Duke said, his voice carrying across the assembled staff, "the Duchess will require a lady's maid. See that one is appointed by morning. In the meantime, ensure that the Duchess's chambers are prepared and that her dinner is brought to her room. She has had an exhausting day." Mrs. Pemberton curtsied again. "Of course, Your Grace." And with that, I was swept into my new life. The Duchess's chambers were grander than anything I had ever imagined. A sitting room with walls of pale blue silk, furnished with delicate chairs and a writing desk inlaid with mother of pearl. A bedroom dominated by a 4-poster bed draped in velvet, with windows that overlooked the rose garden. A dressing room lined with wardrobes that stood empty, waiting to be filled with gowns I did not yet possess. I stood in the center of the bedroom, alone at last, and felt the weight of the day crash over me like a wave. I was the Duchess of Ashworth. I, Eleanor Graves, an orphan with no family and no history and no claim to anything but my own 2 hands, was now the mistress of one of the greatest estates in England. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was the sort of thing that happened in fairy tales and penny novels, not in the cold, hard reality of the world I knew. And yet here I stood, wearing a ring that cost more than I would have earned in a lifetime of service, in chambers that had housed generations of noble ladies, bound by law and church to a man I did not know and did not love. I sank onto the edge of the bed, my legs no longer willing to support me, and I wept. The days that followed passed in a blur of activity and adjustment. A lady's maid was appointed, a young woman named Sarah, who had previously served as an upstairs maid and who approached her new duties with a mixture of nervousness and determination. She helped me dress each morning in gowns borrowed from the previous Duchess's wardrobe, altered hastily to fit my smaller frame. She arranged my hair in styles I had only ever admired from afar. She addressed me as "Your Grace," and curtsied each time she entered the room, and I had to resist the urge to tell her to stop, to remind her that only weeks ago we had been equals. The Duke was absent more often than not, occupied with estate business and meetings with solicitors and the endless demands of his position. When we did encounter one another, at dinner or in the hallways, he was polite but distant, treating me with the same cool formality he might show to a distant acquaintance. He inquired after my comfort, ensured that my needs were being met, and then retreated once more into his own world, leaving me to navigate the complexities of my new role alone. I learned quickly. I had always been a quick learner, had always absorbed knowledge the way a sponge absorbs water, and now I threw myself into the study of aristocratic life with a desperation born of survival. I read books on etiquette and protocol. I practiced my curtsy until my legs ached. I memorized the names and titles of every noble family in England, learning their histories and scandals and alliances so that I might never be caught unaware. Mrs. Pemberton became my reluctant guide, answering my questions with professional courtesy, if not warmth. She taught me how to manage the household accounts, how to plan menus and oversee the staff, how to conduct myself at formal dinners and receiving hours. She did not comment on the strangeness of teaching these lessons to a woman who had so recently been her subordinate. She simply did her duty, as she always had, and I was grateful for her competence, even if I could not quite reach her heart. The Dowager Countess visited on the 5th day, sweeping into the manor like a winter storm, her silver hair perfectly coiffed and her eyes sharp as daggers. She was the Duke's aunt, his father's sister, and she had served as the effective mistress of Ashworth since the death of the Duke's mother some years before. The marriage had displaced her from her position of power, and she had made her displeasure known in no uncertain terms. "So you are the creature my nephew has seen fit to marry," she said, examining me as though I were an insect pinned to a board. I stood in the drawing room, my hands clasped before me, my chin lifted in defiance of the fear that churned in my stomach. "I am Eleanor, your ladyship," I replied, my voice steady. "The Duchess of Ashworth." Something flickered in her eyes, perhaps surprise, perhaps grudging respect. "You have spirit," she admitted. "That is something, at least. But spirit alone will not save you from the wolves of society. Do you have any idea what you face?" "I have some idea," I said. "I am not naive." She laughed, a sharp and humorless sound. "You were a servant girl a week ago. You have no family, no connections, no training. Every lady in London will be waiting for you to fail, hoping for you to stumble so that they might tear you apart. And my nephew." She paused, her expression softening just slightly. "My nephew is not an easy man to know. He has built walls around himself so high that I sometimes wonder if even he can see over them anymore." "Then I shall have to find a way to climb them," I said, the words surprising even myself. The Dowager studied me for a long moment, her eyes searching my face as though looking for something she could not quite name. "Perhaps," she said at last. "Perhaps you shall." She turned toward the door, then paused and glanced back over her shoulder. "I will send my modiste to you tomorrow. You cannot continue to wear the previous Duchess's gowns. It is unseemly. Thank you, your ladyship." She nodded once and was gone, leaving me alone in the drawing room with the echo of her words and the weight of her warning. The modiste arrived the following morning, a petite French woman named Madame Delacroix, who measured and pinned and tutted over my figure with professional efficiency. She promised a full wardrobe within a fortnight, gowns suitable for every occasion from morning calls to formal balls, and I nodded along as though such things were commonplace, as though I had not spent my entire life in the same 3 dresses of plain gray wool. It was during one of these fittings that I first heard the rumors. Sarah, my lady's maid, was brushing my hair that evening when she hesitated, her strokes slowing, her expression troubled in the mirror. "What is it, Sarah?" I asked, catching her eye in the reflection. She bit her lip. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I should not speak of such things." I turned to face her, reaching out to take her hand. "You may speak freely with me, Sarah. I have not forgotten what it is to be in service. If something troubles you, I would hear it." She hesitated a moment longer, then the words came tumbling out. "They are saying terrible things. Your Grace, in the village and in London too, from what I hear. They are saying that His Grace has lost his mind, that he married you as a joke or a punishment to the Sinclair family. They are saying," she faltered, her cheeks flushing, "they are saying that you must have bewitched him somehow, that no duke in his right mind would ever marry a servant girl." I felt a cold weight settle in my chest, but I kept my expression calm. "And what do you believe, Sarah?" Her eyes widened. "I believe you are a good woman, Your Grace. I have known you for 3 years, have worked beside you, have seen your kindness and your diligence. I do not believe in witchcraft or madness. I believe only that fate moves in ways we cannot always understand." I squeezed her hand, grateful for her loyalty even as the rumors echoed in my mind. "Thank you, Sarah. Now let us speak no more of this." But of course, I could not simply put the matter aside. The whispers followed me everywhere, a constant undercurrent to every interaction, every glance, every carefully worded greeting. When I walked through the village on the Duke's arm, performing the duties expected of a new bride, I saw the way the shopkeepers looked at me, the mixture of curiosity and suspicion in their eyes. When I received callers in the drawing room, ladies who came to inspect me like a curiosity at a fair, I heard the barbed comments hidden beneath their polite words. "What an unusual match," Lady Worthington remarked during one such visit, her smile as sharp as a blade. "You must tell me how you managed to capture the Duke's attention. I confess I am most curious." I met her gaze steadily. "I believe, Lady Worthington, that the circumstances of our meeting are well known. His Grace required a bride. I was present and willing. There is no great mystery to unravel." Her smile faltered, just slightly. "How refreshingly practical of you." "I have found," I replied, "that practicality serves one better than romance in the matters that truly count." She left shortly afterward, and I allowed myself a small measure of satisfaction at having held my ground. But the victories were fleeting, the battles constant, and I knew that I could not continue to fight alone forever. It was 3 weeks into my marriage when everything changed. I had taken to walking in the gardens each afternoon, finding solace in the beauty of the roses and the quiet of the winding paths. It was during one of these walks that I encountered the Duke in a way I had not expected. He was standing before the old oak tree at the far edge of the garden, his back to me, his shoulders bowed as though he carried an invisible weight. I started to turn away, to leave him to his solitude, but something in his posture made me pause. Something broken, something grieving. "Your Grace," I said softly, approaching despite my better judgment. "Are you well?" He did not turn. "I am perfectly well," he said, his voice clipped and controlled. "You may return to the house." I should have obeyed. A proper Duchess would have obeyed. But I had never been proper, had never truly learned the art of submission, and so I stepped closer instead, close enough to see what he was looking at. A small stone marker lay at the base of the tree, half hidden by ivy and moss. The inscription was weathered, but still legible. "Here rests the heart of Catherine Anne Blackwell, beloved mother, forever remembered." I felt my breath catch in my throat. I had not known that the previous Duchess was buried here, had not known that the Duke came to visit her grave alone in the quiet hours of the afternoon. I had not known that beneath all his coldness and control, there was a man who still grieved for his mother. "I am sorry," I whispered. "I did not mean to intrude." He was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice was different. Lower, rougher, less controlled. "She died when I was 17, he said. "A fever took her in the span of a week. One day she was laughing in the breakfast room, making plans for the summer. The next, she was gone." I did not know what to say. I had never known a mother, had never had anyone to mourn with such depth and devotion. But I understood loss. I understood the hollow ache of absence, the way it carved itself into your bones and never truly left. "I am sorry," I said again, because there were no other words. He turned then, and I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Pain, raw and unguarded, the kind of pain that time does not heal, only buries beneath layers of duty and distraction. "She would have known what to do," he said. "When Arabella fled, she would have found a way to manage the situation with grace and dignity. Instead." He looked at me, and for a moment I thought I saw something like regret. Instead, I forced a stranger into an impossible position and called it a solution. "You did what you had to do," I said, surprising myself with my own boldness. "You saved your estate and your family's legacy. There is no shame in that, is there not?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I have made you an object of ridicule. Every tongue in London is wagging about the Duke who married his housemaid. You cannot show your face in society without being examined and judged. And for what? For a contract signed by men who cared nothing for the lives they were bartering." I felt a strange warmth bloom in my chest, an unfamiliar sensation that I could not quite name. "You did not force me," I said quietly. "You asked, and I chose to say yes. I knew what I was agreeing to. I knew the consequences. If I am an object of ridicule, then I shall bear it with as much dignity as I can muster. But I will not have you carry the guilt of my choices upon your shoulders. They are mine to carry." He stared at me, his expression unreadable, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. The wind rustled through the oak tree above us, scattering leaves across his mother's grave, and somewhere in the distance a bird began to sing. "You are not what I expected," he said at last. "Nor are you," I replied. And for the first time since the day of our wedding, something shifted between us. A door, long locked, began to creak open. The change was gradual, so slow that I almost did not notice it at first. The Duke began to seek me out, not for matters of household business or social obligation, but for conversation. He would find me in the library, where I had taken to reading in the afternoons, and would sit in the chair beside the window and ask about the book in my hands. He would join me for meals instead of taking them in his study, and though our conversations were stilted at first, awkward with the weight of all the things we did not say, they gradually became easier, more natural. I learned that he had a keen interest in astronomy, that he had once dreamed of traveling to Italy to see the ruins of Rome, that he preferred port to brandy and could not abide the taste of oysters. I learned that his father had been a cold and distant man, more interested in politics than family, and that the Duke had grown up in the shadow of expectations he had never asked to carry. And in return, I told him about myself, about the orphanage where I had been raised, a grim stone building on the outskirts of York where the matrons believed that hard work and strict discipline were the keys to salvation. About the family I had never known, the mother who had left me on the doorstep as an infant with nothing but a blanket and a locket that I still wore around my neck. About my dreams, small and simple as they were, of a life with meaning and purpose beyond the endless cycle of service. He listened, truly listened, with an attention and focus that I had never experienced before. And though he did not offer easy platitudes or false sympathy, I felt something shift in the way he looked at me, a new respect, a new understanding. It was during one of these conversations, on a rainy evening in late spring, that he asked about the locket. We were sitting in the library, a fire crackling in the grate, the sound of rain pattering against the windows. I had been reading aloud from a volume of poetry, something I had never done before, but that he had requested with an almost shy hesitancy. When I finished the last stanza, he set down his glass of port and nodded toward my throat. "That locket," he said, "you wear it always. May I ask what it contains?" I touched the small gold oval instinctively, feeling its familiar weight against my skin. "It belonged to my mother," I said, "or at least, I believe it did. It was left with me at the orphanage. I have never opened it." His brow furrowed. "Never? In all these years?" I shook my head. "I was afraid," I admitted. "The matrons told me that my mother was likely dead, that the locket was all I would ever have of her. I did not want to open it and find nothing inside. I preferred to believe that there was something, some clue or message or memory, waiting for me." He studied me for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "And now? Are you still afraid?" I considered the question. The truth was that I had thought about opening the locket many times over the years, had held it in my hands, and imagined what might lie within. But something had always stopped me, some deep and nameless fear that kept my fingers from the clasp. "Perhaps," I said slowly, "I am ready to know." He rose from his chair and crossed to where I sat, kneeling before me with an unexpected gentleness. "Then let us find out together," he said, "if you wish." I looked into his eyes, those dark eyes that had once seemed so cold and distant, and I saw something there that made my heart skip in my chest. Kindness, genuine, unguarded kindness. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and lifted the locket from around my neck. My hands were trembling as I found the tiny clasp, as I pressed my thumbnail into the seam and felt it give way. The locket sprang open, and I looked down at what lay inside. A miniature portrait, no larger than my thumbnail, painted with exquisite delicacy. A woman's face, young and beautiful, with dark hair and autumn-colored eyes. My face, and on the opposite side, an inscription in tiny, elegant script, "To my dearest Eleanor. May you find the love I could not give you. Your mother, Catherine." The room spun around me. The fire roared in my ears. The Duke was saying something, asking something, but I could not hear him, could not think, could not breathe. Catherine. The name echoed in my mind, over and over, refusing to make sense, and yet making all the sense in the world. Catherine. The same name inscribed on the stone marker beneath the old oak tree. Catherine Anne Blackwell, the previous Duchess of Ashworth. My mother. I do not know how long I sat there, frozen, the locket clutched in my trembling hands. I was dimly aware of the Duke speaking to me, of his hands on my shoulders, of the concern in his voice. But I could not respond, could not do anything but stare at the tiny portrait of a woman who had my face, my eyes, my very soul. It was impossible. And yet. The questions that had haunted me all my life, the identity I had never known, the family I had never had. They were answered now, in the cruelest and most impossible way. I was not simply Eleanor Graves, orphan and servant. I was Eleanor Blackwell, illegitimate daughter of a duchess, half-sister to the man I had married. No. The word tore from my throat as I lurched to my feet, the locket falling from my hands. No, this cannot be, it cannot be true. The Duke caught my arm, steadying me, his face pale with confusion and concern. "Eleanor, what is it? What have you seen? Speak to me." I looked at him. This man I had come to care for more than I had ever intended, and I felt my heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. "The portrait," I whispered, the words coming out broken and ragged. "The inscription. It says my mother's name was Catherine." His brow furrowed. "I do not understand." "Your mother," I said, and saying the words aloud made them horribly, unbearably real. Your mother's name was Catherine. Catherine Anne Blackwell. His face went very still. Yes, but what has that to do with... He trailed off. I watched as the realization dawned, as the pieces clicked together in his mind, as the horror of understanding spread across his features. No, he said, his voice barely audible. No, that is not possible. I pulled away from him, wrapping my arms around myself as though I could hold together the pieces of my breaking heart. It is possible, I said. I have her eyes. I have her face. I am her daughter. Which means we are family, he finished, the words falling like stones into a frozen pond. I nodded, unable to speak, unable to do anything but stand there as the world I had built came crashing down around me. The Duke turned away from me, his hands pressed to his face, his shoulders shaking with what might have been laughter or might have been despair. When he spoke again, his voice was muffled. My mother, he said, my sainted, perfect mother, who never put a foot wrong, who was held up to me all my life as the model of virtue and grace. She had a child out of wedlock. She abandoned that child at an orphanage and never spoke of it to anyone. I did not correct him. I did not point out that the inscription suggested she had loved me, had wanted something better for me than the life of an illegitimate child in a noble household. I simply stood there, silent and shattered, waiting for whatever came next. He lowered his hands and turned back to face me. His expression had changed. The shock and horror were still there, but beneath them was something else, something harder to read. This changes nothing, he said. I stared at him. What? This changes nothing, he repeated. You are still my wife. I am still your husband. We are joined by law and by church, and no discovery, however startling, can undo that. But I struggled to find words. We are related. We share blood. The marriage is... He stepped closer, and I was suddenly aware of how tall he was, how imposing, how impossible to look away from. The marriage is legal, he said firmly. Consummation has not occurred. When we wed, neither of us knew of this connection. There is no sin here, Eleanor. There is only... He paused, something flickering in his eyes. There is only the realization that fate is more complex than we ever imagined. I shook my head, tears streaming down my cheeks. I do not understand. How can you be so calm? How can you stand there and speak of fate when everything we thought we knew has been overturned? Because I have learned, he said quietly, that there is no profit in railing against what cannot be changed. My mother kept a secret. She had her reasons, and they died with her. You are her daughter, which means you are my sister, but you are also my wife, and I find... He hesitated, and for a moment his composure cracked, revealing the turmoil beneath. I find that I do not wish to lose you. The words hung between us, heavy with meaning I was not prepared to examine. I looked into his eyes, searching for something, anything, that would help me understand what I was feeling, what I was supposed to do. We cannot continue as husband and wife, I said, my voice breaking. You know that. We must seek an annulment, must find some way to undo what has been done. And then what? He asked. You return to being a servant. You disappear into the world with nothing but the clothes on your back and a locket that proves your heritage? He shook his head. I will not allow that. You are the daughter of a duchess. You deserve more than a life of obscurity. But the scandal, I protested weakly. If the truth comes out, if anyone discovers. They will not discover, he said firmly. The only people who know are you, me, and whoever my mother confided in, if anyone. We will keep this secret between us. We will continue as we have been, maintaining appearances for the sake of society, and in private. His voice softened. In private, we will be family, in the truest sense of the word. I wanted to argue. I wanted to insist that this was wrong, that we could not simply carry on as though nothing had changed. But I was tired, so desperately tired, and the thought of losing everything I had gained, the home, the security, the tentative connection I had formed with this complicated man, was more than I could bear. "I need time," I whispered. "Time to think, time to understand." He nodded slowly. "Take all the time you need. I will be here when you are ready." And so I retreated to my chambers, clutching the locket that had revealed so much and yet explained so little. And I wept for the mother I had never known and the life I had never been allowed to live. The days that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions. I avoided the Duke when I could, taking my meals in my room and pleading headaches when callers arrived. I knew I could not hide forever, but I needed the solitude, the space to process what I had learned and decide what it meant for my future. I spent hours studying the portrait in the locket, searching for answers in my mother's painted eyes. Why had she given me away? Had she loved me, as her inscription suggested, or had I been merely an inconvenience to be disposed of? Had she ever thought of me in the years since? Had she wondered what had become of the child she had abandoned? I would never know. The dead keep their secrets well, and Catherine Anne Blackwell had taken hers to the grave. But even as I grieved for the mother I had lost, I found myself thinking more and more of the man I had married. The Duke had shown me a side of himself I had not expected, a depth of feeling and loyalty that contradicted everything I had believed about him. He had not recoiled from the revelation of our shared blood. He had not cast me out or treated me as a burden to be discarded. He had called me family, had promised to stand by me, had looked at me with eyes that held something more than mere obligation. Was it possible, I wondered, that he felt for me what I was beginning to feel for him? The thought was terrifying, and yet it was also, undeniably, thrilling. It was on the 7th day of my self-imposed isolation that the Duke came to me. I was sitting by the window in my bedchamber, watching the sun set over the gardens, when there was a knock at the door. Before I could respond, it opened, and he stood on the threshold, his expression grave but determined. "May I enter?" he asked. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "You have been avoiding me," he said. It was not an accusation, merely a statement of fact. "I have been thinking," I replied. "And what conclusions have you reached?" I looked at him, this man who was my husband and my brother, and yet somehow more than either of those things. "I have concluded," I said slowly, "that I do not wish to leave." His expression did not change, but something in his eyes flickered, something that might have been hope. And the matter of our connection? I rose from my chair and crossed to stand before him. "We share blood," I said. "That cannot be changed. But I have spent my entire life longing for a family, for someone who would claim me as their own. If fate has given me a brother instead of a stranger for a husband, then perhaps that is not a tragedy. Perhaps it is a gift." "A gift," he repeated, his voice rough. "You have been more kind to me than anyone I have ever known," I continued. "You have treated me with respect and dignity, have given me a home and a name and a purpose. You have shown me that I am capable of more than I ever believed possible." He stepped closer, and I felt my heart begin to race. Whatever we are to one another, whatever name society gives to our bond, I know only that I do not wish to lose you. "Nor I you," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper. We stood there, inches apart, the air between us charged with something I could not name. I thought of all the reasons why this was wrong, why we should step back and maintain the proper distance that our situation demanded. But I thought also of the loneliness I had endured, the years of invisibility and isolation, the desperate longing for connection that had driven me through every day of my life. This man understood that loneliness. He had lived it himself behind his walls of ice and duty, And in finding each other, we had found something neither of us had ever expected. A chance, a choice, a new beginning. I reached out and took his hand. "We will face whatever comes together," I said, "as family, as partners, as whatever we are meant to be." His fingers tightened around mine. And for the first time since I had known him, Edward Blackwell, the 7th Duke of Ashworth, smiled. The months that followed were transformative, though the transformation was subtle, visible only to those who knew where to look. To the outside world, we were the Duke and Duchess of Ashworth, a peculiar but seemingly stable couple who had weathered the scandal of our unconventional marriage and emerged with our dignity more or less intact. I learned to navigate the treacherous waters of aristocratic society, to smile at the barbed comments and deflect the probing questions, to present a face of serene confidence even when my heart was churning with uncertainty. The Dowager Countess became an unexpected ally. She had known Catherine better than anyone, had been her closest friend and confidant, and when Edward shared with her the secret of my parentage, her reaction was not what I expected. "I always knew," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Catherine told me about you when you were born. She wept for weeks after she gave you up, but she believed it was the only way. An illegitimate child could never have been accepted. She would have been ruined, and you along with her. She hoped that by giving you to the orphanage, she was giving you a chance at a life free from the scandal of your birth. And now," I asked, "now that I am here, now that I know the truth?" The Dowager reached out and took my hands in hers. "Now," she said, "you are exactly where you belong. You are Catherine's daughter, and you are a Blackwell. No one can take that from you." Her acceptance meant more to me than I could express. In the weeks and months that followed, she became my mentor and my friend, teaching me the subtle arts of aristocratic womanhood that no book could convey. She introduced me to the ladies of her circle, powerful women who had the ability to make or break reputations with a single word, and she made it clear that I had her full support and protection. Gradually, the whispers began to fade. The scandal of our marriage receded into memory, replaced by newer, juicier gossip about other families and other failures. I was still regarded with curiosity by some, with suspicion by others. But I was no longer the pariah I had been in those first terrible weeks. And through it all, Edward was by my side. We had not spoken of love. We had not crossed the boundaries that our shared blood imposed, had maintained separate chambers and the careful distance of siblings rather than spouses. But there was something between us, something unspoken but undeniable, that grew stronger with each passing day. I saw it in the way he looked at me across the dinner table, his eyes lingering on my face with an intensity that made my breath catch. I felt it in the way his hand would brush against mine when we walked in the gardens, a touch so light it might have been accidental, but never was. I heard it in the way he said my name, Eleanor, as though the word itself was a prayer. We were bound together in ways that went beyond blood and beyond law, bound by the shared experiences and shared secrets that had shaped us both. And though I did not know what the future held, though I could not see past the uncertainty of our impossible situation, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I loved him. I loved Edward Blackwell, my husband and my brother, with a love that was neither romantic nor familial, but something entirely its own. I loved his strength and his vulnerability, his coldness and his hidden warmth, his determination to do what was right, even when the right path was not clear. I loved the man he had been, the man he was, and the man he was becoming. And I believed, though I dared not say it aloud, that he loved me too. It was in the autumn of that year, nearly 8 months after our wedding, that the truth about Lady Arabella finally came to light. She had fled to the continent, we knew that much, disappearing into the anonymous crowds of Paris or Rome or some other city where scandal was less fatal than in England. But we did not know why she had fled. What had driven her to abandon her betrothed at the altar and bring ruin upon both their families? The answer came in the form of a letter, delivered by a servant who had traveled from Italy with instructions that it be placed directly into the Duke's hands. I was in the library when Edward found me, the letter clutched in his fingers, his face pale with shock. "She is married," he said without preamble. "Arabella. She married a month after she left England to an Italian count she had been secretly engaged to for years." I stared at him, trying to process the implications. Secretly engaged? He nodded, sinking into the chair across from me. Apparently, she loved him since she was a girl. Her family forbade the match, insisted she must marry someone of higher rank and greater fortune. When her father arranged the engagement to me, she tried to refuse, but was threatened with disinheritance. "And so she agreed," I said slowly. "She agreed to marry you, even though her heart belonged to another. She thought she could go through with it." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I had come to recognize. She convinced herself that duty was more important than love, that she could learn to be a good wife even if she could not learn to love me. But when she stood at that altar, when she looked at me and knew that she was about to bind herself forever to a man she did not want, she ran, I finished. He nodded again. She ran, and she never looked back. We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of this revelation settling over us. I thought of Lady Arabella, the woman I had envied and resented and never truly known. I thought of the fear I had seen in her eyes on that day in the cathedral, the desperation that had driven her to flee. She had not been a villain in this story. She had been a woman trapped by circumstances beyond her control, a woman who had done the only thing she could to save herself. Just like me. "Do you regret it?" I asked quietly. "The marriage, I mean. Do you wish she had stayed?" Edward looked at me, his dark eyes meeting mine with an intensity that stole my breath. "Regret?" he repeated. "Eleanor, if Arabella had stayed, I would have spent my life married to a woman who loved another man. I would have been a duty, an obligation, a burden she was forced to bear." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Instead, I have you. A woman who chose me when she had every reason to refuse. A woman who has stood by my side through scandal and revelation and every challenge this world has thrown at us. A woman I—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat, and I saw something vulnerable in his expression, something raw and terrified and hopeful. "A woman you what?" I prompted, my heart pounding. He rose from his chair and crossed to kneel before me, taking my hands in his. "A woman I love," he said, the words falling like autumn leaves, gentle and inevitable. "I love you, Eleanor, not as a brother loves a sister, not as a husband loves a wife out of duty. I love you as a man loves a woman, with all my heart and all my soul and everything I am." Tears streamed down my cheeks, but I was smiling so wide that it hurt. "And I love you," I whispered. "I have loved you for so long that I cannot remember a time when I did not." He reached up and cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away my tears. "We cannot be as other couples are," he said. "We cannot have what society considers a proper marriage. But we can have this. We can have each other, in whatever way we choose, for as long as we both shall live." I leaned into his touch, feeling the warmth of his skin against mine. "Then, that is enough," I said. "More than enough. It is everything." He pulled me into his arms, and I let myself be held. Let myself feel safe and loved and whole for the first time in my life. We had found each other through chaos and scandal and the cruel machinations of fate. We had learned the truth about our shared blood and chosen to stay together anyway. We had built something out of the wreckage of our pasts, something strong and beautiful and entirely our own. And in that moment, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, Whatever storms we might face, we would face them together, as family, as partners, as two souls who had found their way home. The years that followed were not without their difficulties. The truth of my parentage remained a closely guarded secret known only to Edward, the Dowager, and myself. There were times when the weight of that secret pressed upon me, when I longed to claim my mother's name openly and take my rightful place in the family that had been denied me. But I had learned, through hard experience, that some things are more important than public recognition. I had a home, a purpose, a man who loved me with a depth and devotion I had never dreamed possible. I had found my family, not through blood alone, but through the bonds we had chosen to forge. We never had a child of our own. Given the circumstances, we both agreed that it would not be wise, would raise questions we could not answer, and risk consequences we could not control. But we found other ways to leave our mark upon the world. We established a foundation in Catherine's name, dedicated to supporting orphaned girls and giving them the education and opportunities that might otherwise be denied to them. We opened the doors of Ashworth Manor to young women from every walk of life, teaching them skills and graces, giving them hope and possibility where before there had been only despair. Edward softened over the years, the ice around his heart melting slowly beneath the warmth of our shared love. He smiled more often, laughed more freely, allowed himself to be seen as the man he truly was rather than the cold and distant Duke society expected him to be. He told me once that I had saved him, that without me he would have been lost in the darkness of his own isolation forever. But I knew the truth. We had saved each other. When the Dowager passed, peacefully in her sleep at the age of 83, we mourned her together, holding each other through the long nights of grief. She had been our ally, our confidant, the keeper of our secrets, and the guardian of our happiness. In her will, she left me a letter that she had written on the day of my wedding. A letter she had never shown me before. "My dearest Eleanor," it read, "I write this knowing that you will not read it until I am gone, when the truth can no longer hurt anyone. Know that your mother loved you more than life itself. Know that giving you up was the hardest thing she ever did, that she wept for you every day until her death. Know that in finding you, in bringing you back to us, fate has done what she could not. You are where you belong. You are loved. And you carry within you the best of Catherine, the woman who was my dearest friend, and who I miss with every beat of my heart. Be happy, my child. That is all she ever wanted for you." I wept over that letter for hours, but they were tears of healing rather than grief. My mother had loved me. She had wanted me. She had done what she believed was best, even though it broke her heart. And through some miracle of fate, I had found my way back to the family she had been forced to hide me from. It was more than I had ever dared to hope for. It was everything. As I write these words, I am an old woman now, my hair silver, and my hands marked by the years. Edward sits across from me in the library, reading as he always does in the evenings. His face lined with age, but still as dear to me as it was on the day we first truly saw each other. We have loved each other for 40 years, through scandal and secret and the relentless passage of time. We have faced the world together and carved out a place for ourselves within it, a place defined not by society's rules, but by the depth of our devotion. I think often of that day in the cathedral, when Lady Arabella fled, and Edward took my hand and changed both our lives forever. I think of the terrified servant girl I was, invisible and unremarkable, who never imagined that such a thing could happen to someone like her. I think of the choices I made, the risks I took, the love I found in the most unexpected of places. And I know, with a certainty that time has only strengthened, that I would not change a single moment. Life is strange, and fate stranger still. But sometimes, if we are very lucky, the strangest paths lead us exactly where we are meant to be. I was born an orphan, raised a servant, and became a duchess through the whims of chance. But I am more than any of those things. I am Eleanor Blackwell. I am loved. and I am finally eternally home.